Good morning. Welcome everyone. Everyone who's here in person, everyone who's here online. Welcome to Montclair State University. My name is Dr. Doug Larkin. I'm a professor in the Department of Teaching and Learning. And my colleague, Sandra Adams, who's done all of this with me, will be here this afternoon to close our session. We're really excited to host you here at Montclair State for the 2023 NSF Noyce Improving Novice Teacher Retention Conference. For those of you who are online, we were here yesterday as a smaller group. I'll talk a little bit about the study that led to this, but we had a number of people who worked pretty hard yesterday. I think somebody told me, boy, Larkin worked as hard yesterday. Yes. I appreciate everything that you did yesterday. That's going to be paid forward to the attendees who are here virtually, and we hope we make this a worthwhile session for you. I know that I personally have really benefited from all of the wisdom in this room over the past day. So just a few housekeeping things for those of you who are here. If you do need parking passes, please see Khadijah, or if you have forms to turn in, anything that administrative, please let her know if there's any questions, even about Wi-Fi or anything. She's the one. Also, at the end of the day today, those of you going to the Edison Museum with us, we're going to have two buses. One's going back to the MC Hotel. The other is going to the Edison. It's actually Edison National Historic Park. If you would like to take your own car there, you're more than welcome to. And of course, we want to offer a welcome to, we have a couple hundred people who are online joining us today and in the future. If you're watching this, a recording of this, we're glad that you're with us. Before we get started, are there any burning questions from the group who's here about anything going on? I think we're good, but I always like to put this slide in there. Okay. So the agenda for today, for the first half hour, I'm going to share some findings from our induction and mentoring, from our Impressed project. And then at 9:15, we're going to have a panel discussion. And again, for those online, what we're going to present for that hour from 9:15, a little longer than that, to 10:45, is a discussion of everything that we put together yesterday as a group of our collected wisdom about the retention of novice teachers. At 11 o'clock, we'll have our keynote speaker, Tuan Nguyen from Kansas State University. And then at 12 o'clock, we will replay Julia Hazel's keynote from yesterday. And Julia has graciously agreed to hop back on for a little bit of Q&A at the end of that. For anybody watching online, you can we'll monitor the chat, and if there are questions for our speakers, we'll make sure that they get asked and responded to if we have enough time for everyone. And then at 1 o'clock, we'll have our closing remarks and a little bit of conversation from the room on that. All right. Okay. So, so my task now for the next sort of 30 to 45 minutes is to set the table in terms of the research that our group undertook over the past 5 years around this central question. In districts that have demonstrated comparatively more successful novice science teacher retention, what are the factors that relate to such retention? And I'll say from the outset something I said yesterday is our lens was very narrowly focused on science teacher education, but almost immediately we had to broaden it to just teacher retention generally. One of the things that we found was that the practices that impacted the novice science teachers really impacted all the novice teachers in that district. And so even this conference we've framed as novice teacher retention rather than just novice science teacher retention. There are a handful of science-specific things that I'll sprinkle in throughout the talk today. But I think it's important to mention that, and it was something that was maybe a little surprising to us, that it wasn't just science-specific, it was teacher retention efforts from the district as a whole. So this project is funded by the National Science Foundation, and what we did is our aim was to describe what's being done in districts where novice science teachers were successfully being retained. And given the amount of time and resources we had, we limited our study to 4 states in the U.S., New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and North Carolina. And we looked specifically at teachers in high-need schools and the retention of teachers of color. And because this was a Noyce Foundation, National Science Foundation grant through the Noyce program, we also looked at recipients of Noyce scholarships. I'm not going to talk so much about that one today, but we did come across multiple recipients of Noyce scholarships in the focus districts where we conducted these studies. So what we did is we looked at data from staffing lists. Basically, every state has a list of, okay, here's this teacher and here's what school they're in. And we took 11 years of that data and we used that to track teachers over time. And this was a little different from other studies that look at, okay, does this first-year teacher stay to the next year? Our definition of retention was a 5-year definition. So in order to figure out 5 years of retention, you need 6 years of data. And you can do the math, but it works out that you can do 6 cohorts with 11 years of data. And that's what we did. And so we identified districts that were doing a good job at retaining novice science teachers. And in particular, we also looked to see who's retaining teachers of color. Ultimately, we came up with a pretty long list of districts that were doing an exemplary job in their state. And then our task was to try to maximize our ability to figure out what was going on in those districts. So we started out in New Jersey, and we identified 5 districts, and we went to those districts, and we talked to people. We talked to administrators, we talked to teachers, we talked to supervisors, we walked through the buildings, we got a sense of what was happening in those districts. And that was in 2020, in spring of 2020. And so once the shutdown happened, we moved our research online. And then once we got towards the end, we were able to, for our North Carolina studies, we were able to go back into schools. And so I want to just take a moment here and pause to thank all of the districts, everybody who participated in this research. It's not always easy to conduct educational research that is intrusive, where you're coming into a building. And each one of these, we identified about 20 districts, and then with COVID and the shutdown, we had some constraints there in where we could go and who we could talk to and who had time to talk to us. But we remain eternally grateful for everybody who gave us access to our hard-won knowledge and wisdom. And it really is a testament to the teaching profession that even with all the stressors of COVID era schooling, which we'll talk about a little bit about today, that these districts still let us in. We did promise the districts anonymity, so you notice we have pseudonyms, and for us to keep track of them, all the New Jersey ones were trees, all the Pennsylvania ones were rocks, all the Wisconsin ones were fish, North Carolina birds. Right? That was just a little way for us to keep track. And we did get a nice cross-section of different schooling contexts. Okay, and we wrote a case study for each of these districts, and I think it's also important to say that part of the foundation of this project was to value the voices of teachers. And so we presented a draft of our case study to everybody who did an interview with us, and gave them an opportunity to respond. Many did and said, hey, here's a detail that you might want to put in there, or you don't quite have this one right. So it was important for us to member check our cases with the districts, with the people who shared their experiences with us. So these 13 case studies are up on our website at www.montclair.edu/impressed. And they're available for public use, and we're pretty proud of them. We think this represents capturing some of this hard-won wisdom that educators have shared with us over the past 5 years. So in our small group, we talked a lot about this yesterday. I'll just share this briefly here now. We used a theoretical framework of teacher embeddedness. And this was much more useful to us than just job satisfaction. And this notion of embeddedness comes from the human resources literature. But this idea that you have to pay attention to 2 things when you're asking, do people stay in their jobs? One is the organization. And in our case, these are schools or school districts or other local educational authorities. And also the community in which that job is situated. So this can be like the town, the state, the geographic area, all of these things. So you have those two factors, and then we had to look at what's the fit of the individual, how aligned are what that individual wants with what they can get out of the organization or the community. And yesterday, and we'll talk about this a little more, but yesterday we started talking about this in terms of a sense of belonging. Does the first person feel like they belong to the organization? Do they feel like they belong to the community? The idea of links, that there are relationships that people form within their organization and then also within the community. It's important to attend to both of those. And the idea of assets. What does a person have, what resources does a person have, both tangible and intangible, as a result of being in that organization or being in that community? And assets can be anything from a classroom budget to a short or long commute, or it can be a pretty view on a nice day, right? All these things can be assets to folks. All right, so here's where we share the result of our cross-case analysis. So we took those 13 cases, and we said, what factors are there in common across all of these different contexts? And I have them, I'm going from like most prevalent at the top here, just to share our findings. And we can take sort of the quantitative piece with a grain of salt, right? But I think what's important is that the factors that I'm going to share today showed up in a lot of different contexts. And we had, again, so we had large school districts, large urban school districts, we had small rural districts, we had county vocational school, we had charter schools, we had a really wide range of contexts across these 4 states. And so these are things that popped up in multiple places, in multiple contexts. So I'm going to talk about the general factors related to teacher retention first. And then I want to make a note to highlight the factors that relate to the retention of teachers of color. And I'll end with a note about where mentoring and induction fits into all of this, because we know that that's a really big part of efforts to retain teachers. Okay. So we had these 10 factors. The first is, and I'll go through each of these in turn, but I will say that these first 2 were overwhelmingly the thing that we heard across almost every district. And so again, we were looking in science departments. So if we were talking about elementary teachers, we might substitute departmental colleagues for grade level teams, right? Okay, so the first one, and by the way, these slides we'll share them out publicly. And the groups, if you're here in the room, you already have them in our shared folder. They're under day 2. Okay. So the first one is the support from departmental colleagues. And so there were a couple different pieces of this. And I think that the most important takeaway for me from this whole research project is, while the idea of an individual mentor is important for a new teacher, to have somebody that they can ask questions to, by and large in these high retention districts, what we found is that the whole department, or even in some cases the whole school, acted as a mentor to that new teacher. So rather than an individual mentor, the whole department took responsibility for socializing and mentoring that new person to give them that sense of belonging in the school, to provide them with resources, to help build relationships. Again, you can kind of see that theoretical framework in there. Another thing that we saw is that these high retention districts all had an identity as a science department. Like they would use the first person plural when talking about themselves. We as a science department do this, we do that. And that network of support created by that department was collegial, not adversarial. I have heard horror stories about what merit pay has done to some departments across the country, where all of a sudden teachers who used to cooperate are pitted against each other because there's a pot of money at the end. These districts were not like that at all. We had that collegial network of support was really important. There were a couple districts whose part of their identity, and this wasn't true everywhere, but it was prevalent enough that we want to mention it, that when we talked about the science teachers, a lot of them were second career teachers, and so a lot of them looked at each other as top-notch science professionals, right? Where they looked at they held their colleagues in high regard because of what they had done, both prior to coming to teaching and then as a result of that in teaching. We also heard a lot of words about care and feeling supported, and that the phrase like a close-knit department came up again and again. And so as we think about, what are the implications for this particular finding? Well, if you're a science supervisor or an administrator, what can you do to build this kind of environment in your school, right? I think setting this as a goal, rather than pitting people against each other. Okay, that's sort of an editorial takeaway. But I think if we think about what are the implications for how do we build support within a department? And we can call a department any group of teachers. And then the related piece to that is, what are the systems of support both at the school level and at the district level? And in many of these districts that we studied, there were systems in place. Some of them were mentoring and induction programs. Some of them were less formal. But all of them had some system for socializing the new teachers into the department. It was not a sink or swim environment. For those of us in higher ed, we know that this is important in higher ed when we hire a new colleague into a department. But I think it's equally important in these districts in terms of retaining teachers and, again, giving people that sense of belonging. One of the really interesting things that popped up in a number of places was, as part of that system of support, were shared materials for teaching, right? And this wasn't just like, okay, here's the teacher's manual for this textbook that's in your course. It was more like, here is the shared drive that we all put all of our slide presentations on. Here's every lab, here's every worksheet that we do as a department, and here are the unit plans, right? And so it was that collective nature of the enterprise of teaching that was shared among the colleagues. And it can still be overwhelming for the new folks, but at least there was something there. And I think many of us who entered teaching in places where those systems of support weren't in place, where we kind of had to make stuff up as we go, it's a very different type of work. Another really important takeaway from this study overall was that almost all of the districts and schools that we studied made a very clear distinction between human resource onboarding of new employees and mentoring and induction programs. Now, there are a lot of, and I teach a course here on mentoring and induction at Montclair for doctoral students, and we've looked at many districts' induction plans, and many of them are like human resource onboarding plans, right? Okay, here's where you get your ID, here's where you sign up for insurance, here's where the copier codes are, and one of the things we saw in these school districts is that was not the case. Yes, there were a couple days in late August where you got everything you needed to do your job from a human resource standpoint. But the act of induction was a long-term sustained project. And sometimes, we were thinking of them as one-year things, but there were districts that had 3-year induction programs for novice teachers. Another thing that teachers reported, in particular in these districts, was that there were tangible socio-emotional support efforts from their administrators, and they felt valued as teachers. And that's a hard one to nail down, but you know it when it's not there, right? And I think we'll come back to this when we talk about the teachers of color who were retained in our focus districts. But they felt this, right? To be retained there, this was definitely there. Another piece, another source of support were the different ways that new teachers could be protected from things that would impact their job negatively. In some cases, were administrators thinking carefully about how to structure the coursework and the time that new teachers had to both teach and plan. But we also saw a role for teachers' unions, and particularly in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and we saw it in Wisconsin when it was taken away in 2010. We heard a lot about that from our Wisconsin teachers. And then again, for the students and for the teachers of color, we had some evidence that in districts that did a really, really good job of retaining their teachers of color, they had evidence of what we started calling a culturally protected environment for both teachers and students of color, where from a particular perspective, racism is not something that can be erased or eliminated, right? But to know that it's there and to protect people, teachers and students, from its most harmful effects. In the districts that retain the teachers of color, that was a central project in these districts. And I think it's important to mention here. And it wasn't just predominantly, this was true also in a couple predominantly white districts as well. Okay, so now the thing that NSF asked us to really pay close attention and answer some questions about, and we will have a quantitative paper that comes out about this from our study, but the question of compensation. We know that how much teachers get paid matters a great deal, but how does it connect to retention? And by and large in our districts, the salaries were perceived as sufficient, right? Everybody can say, yeah, if you want to pay me more, I'll take more, right? But the idea that in the districts, teachers didn't feel that they were being taken advantage of or underpaid significantly, right? And it was a little bit of a surprise because, again, if you just out in the culture and you're talking to people, you'll hear like, yeah, teachers are underpaid. But in these districts, teachers felt that, especially when they compared themselves to neighboring districts, they would be like, yes, we're doing okay. It could be worse, it could be better, but we're doing okay. Particularly in New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, where salary was determined on an individual district level in a way that was different from North Carolina, where there's a state pay scale with some local adjustments for salary supplements for cost of living. But in the case study districts, most of the teachers perceived that their pay was a little bit higher than the surrounding districts. Now, when we went to actually look at those numbers, that wasn't always true. But the perception was like, okay, we're doing okay here. In North Carolina, the notion of salary supplements was new to us, coming from New Jersey. So we had to learn a little bit about how teacher pay works in different states. And we ended up writing 4 different state policy case studies for this paper. And I'm saying we, and I'm realizing I forgot a slide here where I show the whole research team. I'm going to put that in at the end. But I need to thank our entire research team who was part of this. I'm realizing in this moment that I forgot to do that. So I'm going to circle back around to it at the end. But so we have these state policy papers where we talk about these differences in the way that salary is considered. And the other thing that was very difficult was to figure out, well, okay, what is a starting teacher actually paid in this district? It turns out that there's, at least in New Jersey, there's only one place where that information lives, and it's with the School Board Association. And so there's not really a centralized database, even though there are lists that are, show up in the newspaper, listen to me, old person, show up online on lists. It's actually kind of hard to figure out what a first-year teacher is paid, and we actually had some trouble figuring out what's our definition of a first-year teacher, right? Because if somebody starts in the middle of the year as a long-term sub and they convert, it doesn't always show up in the data. So another form of compensation that we saw that we thought was important to mark is in most of the districts that we looked at, there were stipends given to the mentors of new teachers. So in most places, there was a mentor assigned to the new teacher. And that was a compensated activity. And so it was a way of showing that, yes, we value the labor that you're putting into working with this new teacher. And again, it's necessary, but probably not sufficient to just have that one person working with the teacher. As I said, the whole department really does mentor the new person, but to have that point person and to have that point person compensated was really important. The other aspect of compensation that we saw was pay for professional development. So there are, I think it's sort of the norm in many districts, and we certainly saw this in our 4 case study states, where professional development is shoehorned into the teacher's day. There's a couple teacher professional development days throughout the year. Teachers are asked to go to professional development. In a lot of these districts, those types of professional development opportunities were teacher-led. But the other thing was that teachers also had opportunity to go to other professional development that they were paid for. Their time and their travel was compensated. And of course, all this money has to come from somewhere, right? I'm kind of not entering into that larger policy issue of where does all this money come from, but we're saying like this is something that matters for teacher retention. And we did have one district, and sometimes the outliers are interesting too, that they had a lower pay in that district, and they knew they had lower pay. But they felt really well resourced in that district, and they're like, we get everything that we ask for. And so they saw it as sort of an okay trade-off for now. This is something else that showed up in the literature that we reviewed for this study, particularly in Richard Ingersoll's recent work, where he's looking at teacher autonomy. And so this factor of teacher autonomy and agency, again, was one of these things that showed up everywhere. And our kind of working definition for how we distinguish between these two terms, autonomy was like you have the freedom to do what you want in your classroom, and agency was like you have some freedom to make decisions over your career, right? So and that might be, that's our working definition. I don't know that's completely reflected in the literature. But again, in many of our districts, teachers reported they liked not being micromanaged, that they were treated as professionals, and they had autonomy in their classroom about how they wanted to run their classroom, but they also had agency in terms of, okay, what classes am I going to teach next year? Like, there was a bit of that both. I'm going to just say this, I don't know there's much we can do about it, but in a number of districts, we had teachers who really, really valued the fact they had a dedicated classroom. They weren't moving around from classroom to classroom. They had a place, and that place was theirs. Yes, maybe there was one class that came in and during the day, but like that was their room. And as a classroom teacher myself, for 12 years, like I know how important that was to just be able to have a space, like to be able to say, I'm going to put stuff up on the walls here, and nobody's going to rip it down, right? And so having their own space was really highly valued when teachers could have it. And it wasn't always there, but it got mentioned a couple times, so we're mentioning it here. Teachers had flexibility in their teaching decisions. And again, that kind of is our definition of autonomy. But this idea that teachers had a voice in the school decision-making, and that sometimes included hiring new faculty. And that was a little bit of a surprise. We kind of thought we'd look for it, but if you're hiring somebody new into your department, it's really nice to have teachers be a part of that decision. And so when it was there, teachers really valued that highly. And I don't see this as a paradox, but like even with that autonomy, part of that autonomy was the freedom to collaborate, right? To be able to say, I want to work with other teachers to build this thing, to build a shared folder to give to a new teacher, right? Like to unit plan. And that was part and parcel of that professionalism. Okay, this one was a little bit challenging to wrap our heads around because it showed up in a couple different places, but we ended up calling this specialness of place. And we had to go deep into the literature, 1978 there, to find a definition that we really liked about place identity, right? It's the way that people feel about where they are. And I'll just read the definition here for those online. Those dimensions of self that define the individual's personal identity in relation to the physical environment by means of a complex pattern of conscious and unconscious ideas, feelings, values, goals, preferences, skills, and behavioral tendencies relevant to a specific environment. So in some cases, this was physical geography. So we had places, I think we had at least one in each state where people said, this is home, this is where I live, I love where I live, I love being able, there were some that were near the water, people liked being near the water, there were some that were in the mountains, people loved being in the mountains. And so there's something about that physical geography that they're like, however I feel about my job, I really love living here, I really love working here. Another big part of this comes from the, again, we saw this in the literature, but the notion of a hometown and having family and community networks. There was also this, and this one popped up in a couple places, but like a district commitment to equity was something that some teachers really value. They're like, they're going to do a good job by the kids here. I see what the leadership is doing. I see how committed they are to the kids. I want to be in this place. That makes the place special. And then we also had the notion of the community partners. I'll talk a little bit more about the partners in a second, but we saw this in a couple university towns where people felt a very strong affiliation to the local university, particularly in regard to whether there were new teachers coming out of that university or whether there were opportunities to partner with that university to do things with the students. Okay, so those are kind of some of the big ones. I'm going to go through the ones that now the next group, they weren't everywhere, but we saw them a little bit in multiple places. So one is teachers really valued having resources for teaching. And those resources for teaching could come from either the school district or the community. Almost all of the teachers that we talked to felt like they had the necessary supplies to teach. You know, if you gave them more money, would they use it? Absolutely. But it was kind of interesting that teachers in the studies that we talked to didn't reach into their own pockets for supplies in the way that, again, is kind of common if you're on social media and you see all the GoFundMes for the different classrooms. Like, that really wasn't happening in these districts. So again, it speaks to that notion of funding schools adequately. But we also saw resources come from community partnerships, whether it was business, higher ed, families, former students. And again, I included this bullet point as a teacher, as a former teacher, because it really stuck out to me. But we heard from multiple districts that, oh yeah, we provide subs to attend professional development. Right? That's something that we just do because we see it's important. This is one that I don't know that this is going to survive our COVID changes and with the labor shortage, but I just want to mark it as something that people felt was valuable. People also said, like, the effects of having adequate resources was it reduced the stress of their teaching. Many of the people we talked to had come from other districts or had taught elsewhere before that they were where they were now. And they said, you know what, like, I worry less about that stuff. And it wasn't just resources for them, it was resources for students. So when we talked about, like, having adequate counselors or social workers for students, that was something that teachers valued. Even, you know, they weren't accessing the resources, but they worried if their students didn't have access to that. And so when the students did have adequate access to counselors and social workers, it made a difference. And here's one of the science-specific things sprinkled in here. Many of the districts, especially science supervisors, they really liked it when the administrators understood the unique needs of teaching science, particularly when it came to budgeting for labs and ordering, you know, live specimens or whatever, you know, if you're ordering plants and, like, things that made science teaching easier were valued by the teachers who stayed in these districts. Many people valued the opportunities and the agency they had for their own professional growth. So this could be professional development, like I already talked about, but it could also be additional certifications or graduate study. You know, they had access and support to those things. They also had leadership roles in providing professional development, as I mentioned earlier, both in and beyond the school district. We had a couple people tell us, like, yeah, I had the opportunity to lead a professional development for, like, a teachers union webinar during COVID, and my administration gave me the day to do that, right? So, and again, that leads to that last bullet point, that encouragement for the opportunities, recognizing that teachers are on a professional trajectory of growth over their careers, and providing people the opportunity and an ability to do that. So this one showed up in a lot of districts, and again, it showed up in interesting ways. But there's specific policies and practices in these high retention districts to support both students of color and teachers of color. And part of that is in the second bullet point, that there were intentional efforts to hire teachers and administrators who reflected the demographic profile of the student body. I think in nearly all the districts in the United States where there are, you know, you have a demographic profile of the teachers and another demographic profile of the students, I'll say in most districts, that demographic profile of the teachers is whiter than that of the students. And so in many of these districts, there were intentional efforts, and part of that relates to the professional development piece, to cultivate those teachers into that professional arc and say, hey, have you ever thought about going into administration? And figuring out support pathways for them. When we talked to novice teachers of color, many of them expressed appreciation of being matched with experienced teachers of color as mentors. And then the last thing, in some schools or districts that were predominantly white, teachers and administrators recognized the responsibility and importance of anti-racism efforts. There were a number of districts that almost sheepishly admitted, like, yeah, we're mostly white. And it's like, okay, but they were still engaged, they still were engaged in engaging in that first bullet point, the policies and practices to support both students and teachers of color, even if their numbers were in single-digit percents in a demographic profile. This was a little bit of a catch-all category. This affordances related to school size, and I don't know that this one has predictive power, but some people really liked being in a smaller school because they said it's a close-knit environment, we get to know everybody, we know the students, the staff, and we get smaller student-to-teacher ratios just because there's not as many people here. And then on the flip side, we had larger schools that said, hey, it's more colleagues, more people to connect to. And it's if I'm not the only physics teacher, if there's 3 other physics teachers again, I have somebody to talk to. So people valued that. And then another thing, so we had a couple very large districts in the study with multiple high schools. And I think having the way that this came up is it was a little bit of a pressure valve. If something wasn't working out for somebody at one school, they could still be employed by the district and say, hey, things aren't working out at South, let me go over to North and see if things are a little better there. And then this final bullet point, we ended up putting back in because it showed up in the data. And we tried not to use job satisfaction because it's easy to measure, but it doesn't predict much. And that's why we didn't use job satisfaction as a theoretical framework. But it did come up in our data, and so we felt obligated to include it. That people felt satisfied teaching specific populations of students, particularly in high-need schools. People felt that self-efficacy, that Bandura construct of like, what I'm doing is valuable and I can see the effect of it. A number of districts really had teachers who said, wow, our students are amazing and they're invested in what we do, they're really engaged. I couldn't imagine teaching anywhere else because of these students here. There was a different stripe of that talked about giving back to their hometown and community. We had a tremendous number of teachers who were teaching in schools that they graduated from. It was overwhelming. And I know that there is some research on there about this, but I know we have a number of doc students in the room. This is an interesting question. This is an interesting thing to study. We can kind of guess why, right? But if we're looking at this question of producing new teachers, and how do we get teachers for our schools? And the Grow Your Own teacher education literature already knows this, but there's a lot more here. There's definitely something about that, and it's not just like safety. It's not just, oh, I'm familiar with it, so let me go back. There's a lot more there. But we saw a lot of that. We started calling them hometown teachers. And then there were things about just teaching that people liked, and we're going to talk a little bit about that on the panel shortly. But there are qualities inherent to teaching that people really, really valued. So a couple points, factors related to the retention of teachers for teachers of color. One was that commitment of the district to the education of children of color was cited by participants as the most significant factor in retaining teachers of color. And I could summarize it by saying, teachers that if they're doing right by the students here, then they're doing right by me too, right? Because I'm here for the kids. And I see that commitment on a daily basis, and I get to be a part of that. So again, we saw that supportive environment for teachers of color. We saw an ongoing and active recruitment of teachers of color from other places. This one is interesting because if there are, at any given point, there's a finite number of certified teachers in the state. And if they're moving from one place to another, yes, things are you're getting more teachers of color in one place, but maybe you're getting less in the other. But there wasn't, I think in these districts that we saw that were doing a good job of retaining teachers of color, they were actively recruiting teachers who were dissatisfied in other districts and saying, why don't you come here? Because look at what we've got going on. The presence of administrators of color cannot be understated. It was really, really important. And I think part of what it does is it signals that professional arc of growth, but it also signifies to the teachers that the leadership knows what life is like as a teacher. And you know that somebody is in the room when it happens, when decisions are being made. And then we also saw that connection to home and family. And I really want to encourage, if you read only a handful of cases, the Kingfisher case was really, really interesting. We did not know that it was a 40% Native American students in that district when we went there. But it was really interesting to see how strong that pull of home and family and kinship really was in that district as part of the teacher retention efforts there. And the last thing I want to mention before we bring the panel up is the role of mentoring and induction in retention. So we can just say it's a sort of blanket statement, state policy and guidance vary greatly, and just because something was in state policy didn't mean that it was actually happening in practice. And I don't know what else to say about that, but like having state policy around mentoring did seem important. It let people say, okay, we're doing what the state wants, but it came down to a question of are the resources there to engage in those policies. In the districts that we saw, yes, people were really trying. But as we looked, some of our other parts of this research, which I'm not going to talk about today, is we looked sort of statewide at what was happening. And we could see in places where the policy was not as strong, it was permission not to do it. I mentioned this already. So official mentors were typically selected to pair with a single novice teacher and compensated. Sometimes they were in the same subject area, sometimes not. That didn't seem to make a difference as long as there was somebody who was a mentor. We saw a number of districts did have mentor training for the mentors. Here's how you work with a novice teacher. Some did not. But in many districts, the onboarding was conceived as a separate process. Okay, I talked about that already. Wide range of induction programs. An interesting one was there were some districts that had coaches beyond the first year. There were some districts that also recognized that somebody coming in with experience from another district might not need like a full mentor, but they could use a buddy, right? And even those buddies were compensated in those districts. Like, okay, you're a new teacher here, you know what you're doing in the classroom, but it's nice to have somebody you can ask questions to that is going to be recognized in our budget as one of our values. And this is kind of a takeaway, and it's not what I expected at all. But though many people describe mentors and induction programs as helpful, most teachers noted it was the informal mentorship they received that influenced their decisions to stay. So again, sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition for retention, having some kind of mentoring and induction program. Okay. All right. So at this, how are we doing? Oh, perfect. Okay, so we're going to take about a 3-minute transition to get folks up here. We're going to have a panel discussion, and we have some questions prepared, sharing the collective wisdom of teacher retention from high retention districts. So if you're watching at home, yes, you have 3 minutes to go grab another cup of coffee, and we'll get folks, you can do that here too. Grab another cup of coffee, and we'll have our panel discussion shortly. Thank you.